Welcome, and thank you for joining Zonta International for this special event in celebration of Amelia Earhart Month. We invite you to join the conversation and are looking forward to your comments and questions today. It is now my pleasure to welcome Zonta International Amelia Earhart Fellowship Committee Chairman, Holly Anderson, to introduce our special guest.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you so much for attending this. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Anastasia Volkova, who is a 2017, and remember that date because it wasn't very long ago, Amelia Earhart Fellow. Dr. Anastasia Volkova is a TEDx speaker, an MIT under 35 innovator. In late 2016, she founded Fluorescent, and since then has taken the company through a transformational journey of commercializing agricultural science, attracting leading investors, Microsoft M12, Airtree, Space Angels, and scaling into the global market. Dr. Volkova's passion is to make science-based agronomy and sustainable crop management an industry standard, and to foster close collaborations between industry and research. Most recently, Dr. Volkova has been included in the BBC 100 Women, a list of 100 inspiring and influential women from around the world for 2020. Welcome, Dr. Volkova.
Thank you so much, Holly, for having me. Thank you for organizing, and thank you everyone who joined us. It's a pleasure to be speaking to the Zonta community about what the last 3 years have brought into my life. And I would be delighted to share some of this journey with you. And my intention behind today's conversation, I hope it's really a conversation more than just a presentation, is to really, share with you how the Zonta Amelia Earhart Fellowship has kickstarted some of this journey and what has been achieved since then, as well as, inspire you to share this story if it inspires more young women to get on the path of science, technology, engineering, and math, and innovation, and entrepreneurship. Without a further introduction to what I'm going to be speaking about, I would like to just start sharing my screen, and you should be able to see it. I hope you can see it full screen now. Megan, if you can give me a confirmation, or Holly.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Okay, let's roll. We only have not that long together. So I am the CEO and founder of Fluorescent, but where did it all start? I was born and raised in Ukraine. This is a photo of southern Ukraine. It's a big dam across the Dnieper River, and it is taken from the island where the Cossacks actually had their first fortress, one of the first fortresses in Eastern Europe. And if you're familiar a little bit with the the European history, the Kievan Rus was a pretty big center. It was basically the first empire in Europe. So it was all starting from that island. So this is where I happened to start and happened to be born. I then moved to first to Kiev to do my bachelor's degree in aerospace in aeronautical engineering, but then shortly to Warsaw, and then to Sydney and Paris. I studied my master's in Poland, then I did my Ph.D. in Australia, and during my Ph.D. I did an internship in France. My studies were all in the aerospace category. And I guess it's an interesting story of how do you get to do a degree in aerospace, which people sometimes attribute too much of the destiny to what happens afterwards. But in the beginning, when you're making that decision, well, how someone makes a decision to actually go and have a career in well, study aerospace, first of all. For me, I was quite interested in computer technologies. I wouldn't say that I was the kind of the geekiest geek in the sense that I knew everything about computers. I was quite interested. I fiddled with them a little bit with hardware back in the day, but back then we used to assemble our own computers, and wanted to do more with computer programs, which was interesting for me. But I also was looking very heavily in international management of international relations. Like I was quite interested in kind of the people side of the business and industry, and I wanted to travel. Up until I was in my bachelor's, I haven't actually traveled outside of Ukraine all that much. I only started traveling when I was in my bachelor's, going to different countries in different places to do work and travel experiences to learn how it is to live in those countries. But we're still at the point where I started studying. So the decision was made in a fairly interesting but deciding way for the, I guess, the rest of my career. In the sense that when I was applying to different schools, to different universities to do my first bachelor's degree, I was really interested to see who had out of these universities international connections. As you can see, I really like the idea of living in different places and working in different places. I'm actually speaking to you from LA right now, where we moved last year. And when I started applying to different universities, I was evaluating not just the kind of the technicality of the degree, but also the ability from that university to potentially take a partner scholarship to a partner university in Europe somewhere, from Kiev transitioning to Warsaw. This is what I was able to do. And I happened to join the aviation university. They had a control systems faculty. And the key thing that sold me on it was that they had the bachelor's in English. In Ukraine, it's pretty special in a sense that very few research institutions, very few universities would be able to give you a certificate or any kind of education in English that would be certified and compatible with the further studies that you might want to do elsewhere in Europe or in English-speaking countries. So this was pretty important to me, as I thought, well, I don't necessarily want to stay in Ukraine my whole life. I would like to travel. I would like to see how people live and work elsewhere, to grow, to learn from all these different experiences. And so that was a deciding factor. And that brought me to do the degree in the control systems, effectively avionics, aeronautics, in a university that was aviation university. So this is how it all started. Unfortunately, I had no idea of Amelia Earhart back then, but I had my own family, and I want to share with you today a little bit about how they inspired me, what is that they gave me. My granddad was a civil engineer, so he actually managed the office with many drafters and kind of architects or civil engineers, and I was privileged enough to go on some field trips once to him when he would have the surveying equipment, and they would go and understand, like measure how the ground is undulating, what the topography is, to then model it. And they were only starting to use computerized software, computerized mapping and modeling when he was working in the department. And he was very forward looking, and he said, well, we're using these programs on our computers at work. Why don't you come and see if you like it one day? It's like a bring kids to work type thing. And I really liked, I still remember the program. It was called Coral Draw. It still exists. It's a beautiful program for not just kind of creating visuals, but actually you could do an engineering drawing. It has mathematical background behind the curves that you can draw on the screen. So you can kind of parameterize your drawing. And this just was so mind-blowing that back then there was already such a powerful tool to what I was playing with as a kid was just cute shapes, and I really wanted to know how all these things worked. And I was basically drawing, like drawing on the whiteboard or drawing with a piece of, with the crayons on the paper. I was drawing in this program that was actually the program that was used by granddad's civil engineers to do some sophisticated blueprints. Grandma, she was a teacher at primary school, and actually in kind of boarding schools as well. She taught Russian language, literature, ethics, aesthetics, and my mom is an all-around champion. She's, I think, someone who's inspired me to be who I want to be, who I'm working on becoming. She actually has electrical engineering as her degree. She taught in equivalent of TAFE in Ukraine, which is basically like a college that you would go to if you only finished middle school, but before you want to go to high school. And why I'm telling you this is at the time when I was already, over 7 years old, mom actually wasn't working. That was after the breakdown of the USSR. So she wasn't working for like defense based kind of drafting electronics bureau anymore. She was working for mayor's office. So she switched from electrical engineering, PCB board drawing to doing HR and managing people and managing the planning for the whole region in which I was born. And I saw her as someone who's a manager, as someone who needs to lead kind of by example rather than by the authority. And I knew that she had technical background. So when it came to me going to university, what she said to me, this is the logo of National Innovation University, the kind of the bachelor's institution that I started in. She said to me, you will always have the ability to do another degree like international relations or project management at a later stage in your career. But being young and having the ability to focus on something first, I would strongly advise that you do the technical degree because it helped me a lot in my career. And then she had the wisdom to say that I know you want to travel, but you will be able to travel in any position in the future in which you will excel at. Because if you want to work internationally with companies or with customers or partners, you don't have to have like a travel related position, a travel related type. Like you don't need to join an airline to do this. So I joined Aviation University, which actually, aviation is transport, of course. And then at the point where I was already getting ready to enter into my master's degree, and I was seeking employment before that to get more exposure just outside of student organizations, I was lucky enough to start volunteering and then was employed by the UEFA, European Football Association. And I ran as a dispatcher the operations in Kiev, which was one of the main city centers for the Euro 2012 that Poland and Ukraine hosted. Then I moved to Poland, and master's was very focused on doing my research and coursework in half the time because this is how much I had the scholarship for. And I wanted to take on that challenge that I would actually finish the master's in 1 year, because that program with the Ukrainian university didn't allow to necessarily go beyond that. Alongside all of this studying, I actually was getting more involved in working on with startups, with founders of other startups. I wanted to know how they did what they did. I've taken a course on entrepreneurship from Cisco. They have a network of affiliated universities that can give those courses for free. And I've recently spoken to their community, and I encouraged them to take those courses. It's really great, the resource and early stage when you're trying to figure out what this tech world or entrepreneurship world is for you. Having worked in a couple of startups in Europe, I still wanted to finish my academic journey at a point where I would be able to point at it and say, this is what I've done. As well as I still thought that Poland is not necessarily the country where I want to live in for my entire life. I love Poland, don't take me wrong, but I wanted to explore what was further beyond that. And Sydney University was something that, how it came to be an option for me is another interesting story that serendipity, maybe you can say. But with my granddad, who, as you now all know, it's a bit of exposure to so many people about your personal history. He was running the civil engineering office, and they offered the employees the opportunity to go on a summer kind of camping site where they would be hosting, like they would have some accommodation for their management and senior staff and for their general staff as well. And so I met on one of these kind of summer vacation trips with mom and granddad. I met a colleague of my granddad who was a lot younger, probably like I am now. And she told me about her sister who went to New Zealand and got a scholarship. And I'm like, oh, New Zealand? I never thought about going and studying in New Zealand. Let me look at it. And then I actually found a professor who, this was, years apart. This is like a 10 years difference between when I started university. 10 years before that, I met that person who told me about New Zealand. And then many years later, I ended up applying for Sydney University to actually pursue my degree in aerospace engineering. And it's in that stage where I have found that Zonta, Amelia Earhart Fellowships were open for submission. And I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to, be selected as one of the fellows, which granted me the opportunity to not just kind of study and rely on the scholarships to kind of earn my living a little bit, but actually be able to look beyond just earning the money for the living and kind of educating myself and doing research. But I was always drawn to businesses. I've been involved in a few before starting my PhD. We co-founded 2 small businesses with my technical co-founder, and first engineer of Fluorescent. He became the first engineer of Fluorescent. So I was really feeling the urge to not have to do, the tutoring job and teach at the museum and do something else to make my ends meet. And Zonta, Amelia Earhart Fellowship allowed me to do that. And I was actually able at that point to say, well, look, what motivates me? I have worked for several companies. I know what kind of interests I have generally, but there are so many problems in the world that are so big and fundamental. There's globalization, climate change. We become more and more acutely aware of it every day. There is, growth of global population growth that's not met by the food production. There is this logic of we have middle class, but we still have the big divide between the poor and the rich and the poor. We have all this technology that's coming into the space that's supposed to solve some of these problems and should be able to. And then ultimately, you have people who are creating the new way that the economy runs. You have consumers who are becoming more and more aware of the environmental impact of their choices, and they want to have brands that are shaped by the positive environmental mission and vision. And I thought, as someone who was studying aerospace engineering, specifically the remote sensing component, the sensors on board, as well as the cameras and the data that the cameras collect when they fly on planes or drones or satellites. And the fact that I was so mentally accustomed to agriculture, growing up in Ukraine, then working in and studying in Poland and in France, huge agricultural countries, Australia, even bigger. They're a massive exporter because they have not a very large population and very large land area to farm. This is where Fluorescent idea came, and the exploration of Fluorescent effectively coincided with being awarded a Amelia Earhart Fellowship, where I started Fluorescent as a project in an entrepreneurship course with a few other students who were still kind of exploring whether this idea is viable. The idea was there's satellites starting to capture the data of the entire planet. Back then, it was not as frequent, but still a lot of data. All of these imagery of agricultural fields, wouldn't it be helpful if the farmers and their advisors, agronomists, would know how to interpret that data? Of course, that's such a fundamental thing that as someone who works with that data all the time and knows where to get it, where do satellites put it, how to translate the data from that format into the format that a human can read, and then there's added complexity coming with that you're looking at living things, plants, you need to have a lot of context in how you can interpret that data. But there was a clear need for that in my head, and Fluorescent was the idea that I was able to explore further by going and talking to agronomists. And one of them is right here in the center. She's pictured with her young daughter, Penelope, Brooke Sawyer. She was one of the first agronomists I called, Steve Richmond here at the bottom left. And I know all of these people by the name, but some of them have been in the first cohort of people I've ever called and asked, look, I have access to this data. I think it's going to be so helpful to you. What do you currently do to improve your crop scouting efficiency? How do you know when the plants get sick? How do you know how much fertilizer or water do they need? Based on what are you making those decisions? And since then till now, it's been 4 years of making sure that tens, if not hundreds, of agronomists now in 45 countries around the world, across many millions of acres, receive this type of information, this type of insight from the platform that we've built in a way that's digestible for them. Now let's talk a little bit about what the Fluorescent does, because I feel like I've inferred it a number of times, but I have not spelled it out in this conversation yet. So we have a platform, it's a cloud-based platform. Effectively, you can think of it as it's a simulator in the cloud, and it simulates crops. How do you know if the crop, like what crop height should it be? How many leaves should it have? What is the fertilizer requirement that it has at this growth stage? What growth stage is it at in the first place? We can actually calculate all of those parameters if we take an area on the ground, so basically a polygon that delineates a field. We collect some soil and weather information from it. There are some public sources in some countries, this information is less available, but generally where we work, we have this information from either public sources or farmers. Basic information on where the field is, what has been planted. We then can run agricultural models to project the potential of this crop and to say, if you planted this wheat or this sunflower or this cotton or potatoes at this point in time, we know what happened to it since then, and we're able to predict for you what the crop potential should look like. And here's an agronomist in the golden circle. So we give this information to an agronomist. At the same time, we hold that information and use imagery. Maybe the agronomist flies a drone, or maybe there's a local company providing regular aerial photos. Generally, for all of our international customers, I mentioned 45 countries, we use satellite for 99% of the data that we need from that box. We use the satellite imagery to determine those same parameters. If the model said that the growth stage should be this many leaves, what do we get from the satellite imagery? Is it similar? Is it different? And then we can marry this estimate with a measurement and say to the agronomist, look, your plant has more potential or less potential than what you think. And that delta is what an agronomist can actually act upon. If we're saying, we think that this plant has more yield potential, but it looks like it's maybe growing, it's a little bit behind the growth of other plants that have similar yield potential, we'll be able to outline that area on the map, send the report to the agronomist via email, outlining that this is where we see a problem. so they can actually go and check it in the field and make an appropriate decision. So the agronomist plays a huge part in that as well. What the agronomist is, it's a crop doctor. It's an agricultural scientist who takes care of their farmers' crops, someone who usually advises the farmer on which decisions, like how to calculate the amount of fertilizer you need to grow a certain yield of the crop. So I want to show you just a quick few examples so we can transition to some Q&A that I'm sure will be a lot more fun than just listening to me talk. One example that this system is able to provide is because we analyze all this satellite imagery and we know the basics of agronomy, we know what crops you should plant and what rotation. And generally, farmers and their agronomists, they are trying to adhere to that best practice. You can see the Colorado River basin, Washington on the north part of the river, and Oregon on the south part of the river. And all these circles that you see in the middle, they're differently colored because they actually are different crop types that we detect. So we can look at the area, let's say, oh, I can see where the fields are. Now when I've determined where the fields are, I can tell what's actually growing in them by analyzing the satellite imagery, laying it over with the weather data, running the agronomic models, basically the models, the plant simulators. Like if we assume it's potato, does it look like it's developing like a potato? If we assume it's a cornfield or an alfalfa field or a perennial grass field, this is extremely useful information for a number of applications. One of them, very, very basic, right? Who doesn't love eating potatoes? Like different fries or baked potatoes, like it can be any other crop, right? We can talk about wheat or we can talk about corn or tomatoes, it'll still apply. So when you like those crops, of course, farmers need to make sure that they produce as much as roughly there is demand in the market. So when they roughly know what the demand in the market is, which actually fluctuated a lot earlier last year because of COVID and supply chain disruptions, they try to actually, the companies, the large companies that are taking care of the food processing, they go and contract farmers. They say, this is how many acres worth of potatoes we need, or this is how much potato we need to grow. You can go and figure out how many acres that is. There's like a limitation in this perfect area in the world, in Washington, Idaho area, where you can grow a lot of good potatoes. There's a limitation on where you can plant them because there is a best management practice that you can only plant potato after the field has been not planted in potato for at least 3 years to make sure that we do not have soil-borne diseases, that there is the levels that potatoes kind of adjust in the soil get leveled out by other crops in rotation. So it seems like cool map, maybe something interesting, but at the same time, it actually affects how your food is grown and how the decisions are made about how this food is grown. I can show you more kind of results, but I want to show you kind of one snapshot, just one, before I pause and we'll go to questions. It's working not just on this large scale of county, state, country, it actually works on the subfield level. On the left, there is a picture from the satellite image taken on the 14th of July, where the blue outline is something that specifically the Fluorescent platform identified as potentially a problem that has been developing. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to address that problem in time, and when it was still just half an acre. But almost a month later, this problem was 12 acres, and this was confirmed that this was a disease in that potato pivot. And what that meant is that they had to harvest it separately, they had to deal with it completely separately, they had to, it's all geospatial, so you could walk into this field, locate yourself, and see how you are standing there in relation to this map. These are massive fields, right? So your map will be kind of tiny between these two lines here and here, your location. You'd be able to see that if I accidentally walked into this part of the field that was further down on the eastern side or the western side, and I wouldn't have seen it, this would have been a problem. But because they had a map, they were able to go and actually see it. In practice, I'm, of course, someone who runs a business, so I like when these things are quantified. Finding areas where fields have problems or the potential yield loss, limitation of soil nutrients, can actually bring farmers very significant cost reduction or improvement on the profit side. Because if you can detect and quantify the stress and you know it early on, you can prevent this. For example, 10% of the yield of this field could have been impacted by this particular area. If you translate it into the amount of corn that grows on that 10%, what 10% means is $6,000 of that area alone. And you have gone from maybe as a farmer or an agronomist looking at that field and estimating it to actually having a report that says that's exactly, this is the time when this problem occurred, and this is when we started noticing it. This is the size of this problem. This is the severity and the trend over time of how it's been changing, growing in size, dropping in severity, or vice versa. And there's multiple things that can happen in one field. Planter error that was detected by the grower, but they weren't sure how big the problem was, whether they needed to upgrade this planter. Was it too much of a problem, or was it not really? All of these are financial decisions that need to be quantified in order to be acted upon. And the other option here for people passionate about healthy soils and regenerative agriculture, understanding that part of your soil isn't producing as much because it has a high acidity, whilst the rest of the field actually has a lower ground. It's a topographical feature where just the water and the fertilizer going into that. Maybe given the analysis, it's worth leveling this field, making it as flat as possible, and then being able to apply lime, like apply certain things that make soil acidity less prevalent. Because if you want to grow certain crops like barley, for example, molten barley is used in beer. And barley is generally a feed grain that we use a lot in other applications as well. Like, you can't plant it into that soil because it'll be too acidic for it. So effectively, that's your short trip into the world of agriculture and how it's connected to satellite. And I'm just going to try to jump out of Zoom to stop sharing my screen. Sorry for a little bit of a delay on that up front. But that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you, Anastasia, for such an interesting and informative presentation and how you can use aerospace engineering. It's very innovative and something that we all can appreciate it with the crops. And the work you and your company are doing is very exciting. You are an inspiration. We had some questions before this session. We also have some questions during this session, but since we do have a few questions before, I would like to ask you some of those questions. What did the Amelia Earhart Fellowship mean to you?
It meant to me that I was able to focus in defining years of my PhD on not doing work just because I needed to pay bills, and I was able to support myself and focus on meaningful work that led to creation of this business.
Wonderful. According to the Society of Women Engineers, only 13% of engineers are women. What do you see as the biggest barriers to more women pursuing degrees and careers in engineering?
My general answer to this, I think, is, and this is why I touched on it in my presentation, I want to normalize these stories, because when I was starting, there's this even fun fact that I told mom after I applied to that bachelor's degree, like, oh, mom, I'm actually going to be an engineer now. I could not connect who an engineer was and what job titles and what degrees they were actually doing if because in Ukrainian, it's not called XYZ engineering. It's not. And so when you're going to study something, like how much do you actually understand that, okay, it's not just a technical thing. Like how do you divide, like these are sciences, these are engineering. Currently, everything that's programming is called engineering. Like when we were, at school, that wasn't the case. Whilst now this is a very major part of engineering. And I think that was one of the main shifts, that I was interested in computers, interested in programming, interested, of course, in all the things, public relations, management, project management, people management. But I think normalizing it by sharing the stories of how people get to do what they do, and as well as just giving more examples of how you could get into this, that it's not one size fits all, that you can invent your own job like this. You can do one thing and apply it in a different industry. I think this is what's lacking. I was not able, I guess, to see myself as an engineer, because you see a lot of kind of visualizations of what scientists do. You see a lot of visualizations of what doctors do, firemen, but it's hard to understand what an engineer does. And I think showing that if you're doing engineering, you can become an astronaut. Like that's, mostly, scientists become astronauts because they do science experiments there. But you can be an Air Force pilot like Pam Melroy, and you can lead the shuttle crew to the space station. And it's like, that's a very different pathway.
So did you encounter any barriers in your career? And if so, how did you overcome those barriers?
Yeah, I think everyone faces an imposter syndrome at some point when they're a young woman. And if this is an over exaggeration, I'm glad. I would like it not to be the case, but the young women that I coach and help them grow, I've seen it more often than I haven't. Like I have the team. And on that particular photo that we saw, you didn't see many women, but we actually have quite a number of women in Fluorescent. Of course, it's harder to take pictures when you have a company that has people in 5 different countries. It's hard to, especially in COVID, it's impossible. Well, it's more possible now, actually, to take pictures just like this in Zoom. But coming back to your question of, the ability to overcome challenges that come from just internal mental state and being consistently bolder, pushing to be out there. It's not a comfortable state, but this is you learn that confidence is what counts, and you need to make bets and deliver on your estimates, promises, and keep pushing. And I think execution and how tenacious you are is all that counts.
So do you have any advice for young women and girls who are interested in pursuing an engineering career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the best way for them is to just see the list of famous female engineers and learn a little bit more about what they do, what contributions women now make to win Nobel Prizes on CRISPR technology, and what chemical engineering means. That's engineering too. This is a new world of gender equality. It's not that far away, and I think we need to do our bit in, of course, as a society, making it more visible, making it more normal, maybe making it more popularized, but also making sure we point younger women in the direction of that you don't need to absolutely know everything. And yes, people sometimes behave like that, but there's a certain way that's appropriate to behave at university versus, you need to be bold about your career goals and really be able to show how you want to achieve it. It's a balance of different qualities that's needed, dependent on where they want to be going in the future of the application of their engineering degree. But I like to explain that engineering is basically, it's how things are made. This is the most fun part of life. And if you can show them how it's made videos and tell them that this is engineering, it usually resonates pretty well.
Right. So last week, we kicked off a new webinar series called Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories. In this series, we are exploring what it means to be a leader. As the founder and CEO of Fluorescent, What have you learned about leadership?
A lot. I think I'm learning about leadership every day, especially on a day like today. Um, I had some team meetings earlier. We're growing quite rapidly, so I'm actually working with HR advisor to be able to build the right structure for the rewards in my team and how kind of all the different salary ranges, checks and balances apply. When it comes to leadership, I think of it a lot more now as not just thought leadership that I think I'm more naturally prone to, but actually people leadership. That's the side that is, I guess, harder for me because not only you need to lead the business and the product vision and convince the customers, but you actually need to remember all of the details, of all of the personal aspects that need to be taken into account to make your team feel fully included and cater for what their for the things that are specific about their lives that enable them to be wonderful and making a great contribution, but also needs that they need some additional support. So I think as a leader, I have definitely learned that the vision and the conviction in that vision is something extremely important, but bringing people on the journey, not from where you are, but from where they are. It's one of the and this is obviously deeply personal experience. Maybe people have very many different, leadership is also about decision making, but that's a bit more natural to me. So I'm kind of probably least natural in kind of meticulously going through process of stepping into everyone's shoes and really understanding that, because as someone who has the vision for the business, I'm kind of a little bit impatient in the sense that I want that vision to be realized. And I understood that, yes, if you want to go fast, you go alone. And if you want to go far, you spend the time to go together.
Did you have a mentor or someone that you look up to that's got great leadership that you'd like to talk about or mention?
Yeah, there's a number of people who have great leadership skills. I usually try to stay educated on this topic by attending webinars and different presentations. There was a webinar that COO of GitLab has given during COVID and shared how exactly she manages to do what she does, how they've grown. A lot of very open questions were asked to her. That's the leadership on a next level, and having the transparency, like beyond next level. I'm not saying that I'm one level away from that. Of course not. Like it's beyond there in the stratosphere compared to where I am. But it's the ability to see the transparency, to listen and learn, to hear what decisions were made early on that she advises could have been done differently, and understanding of course we're not aiming to be multi-thousand people company, but some of those leadership lessons apply. So there's a lot of resources on LinkedIn, a lot of people who are good on their topics go live, so to speak. Like there's this function of a kind of streaming on LinkedIn. There's a lot of CEO conversations with other successful CEOs. I know that Nick Mehta, the founder of Gainsight, he usually does kind of CEO chats. That's just someone who pops up in my feed every so often, but I'm sure there are other, people who have this unique network and they're ready to share with you, and you can just get looped into that.
Well, that is all of the questions that we had before today, but I know that Megan has been watching the chats. And so, Megan, I'm going to turn this over to you to see if you can get some of those questions. And thank you, Anastasia, for your presentation and answers to the questions and the insights that you have given us. And you've already accomplished quite a bit. Megan?
Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, we have quite a few questions coming in, Anastasia. Quite a few around your interactions with customers. So who are your clients or customers, and how does a small farmer get to know about you, and kind of how does that customer-client relationship work?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much for that. I would say that Fluorescent, yes, we support some of the smaller farmers, but we do it indirectly because my team is only 30 people at the moment, and we actually support many, many, many millions of acres of farmland and management and monitoring. So the way we do that, with the way we achieve that impact, we focus on impact, on the ability to reach many acres. We actually go to partners in the supply chain. We work with cooperatives, farmer boards. We work with suppliers to farmers. So in the United States, it might be those cooperatives and food processors and retailers that use us on a very large area, and they bring us to their farmers. In Southeast Asia or in Brazil, this might be through a different channel. It might be that, or in Eastern Europe, like in Ukraine, it might be more direct to large farm holders. In Southeast Asia, it's actually through organizations that do kind of offtake from the farmer, so they give them the initial funding to actually be able or inputs to be planting the crop and growing the crop, but then they buy the crop from them, and that's the vehicle through which we come in, because they have the people on the ground to be able to support the farmers, very large number of the farmers, whilst we're a smaller team, so we train their team to support the farmers. I hope that that makes sense. We're kind of not B2C, not business to consumer, we're business to business or business to enterprise.
Yeah, definitely. I think that answers their questions. So we had a question about would your technology be able to um, address crop loss like in developing countries?
Um, yeah, so we actually had a conversation with someone who went from an ag corporate, some of you might be aware of it, Corteva, a gentleman who was pretty much aware of our modeling capabilities, of our crop monitoring capabilities. They went to now be looking after this developing country food and ag investments from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we discussed a project as one of the examples that I just remembered. We discussed on how it would work, and their main concern is the ability to actually, why is there crop loss? Because there's not always enough inputs available to the farmer to actually grow a profitable crop. There's no additional infrastructure that allows, for example, to irrigate, which of course boosts the yields, but also on a very macro scale, we don't necessarily have the right cultivars or hybrids or types of kind of modified crops in a good way. Almost all of the crops are now modified in a good way against climate change, really. So um, not all of the crops are really suitable for those conditions, those harsh and harsher conditions that we're trying to grow the food in. So the crop loss, I think, in those developing countries can be partly attributed to the fact that there's just not enough inputs on the get-go. And that comes back to finance, microfinance. We are quite interested in kind of helping solve this problem, but we as an organization would need like a larger partner to help us do that. We work with the World Bank, International Finance Corporation in Papua New Guinea, for example, in a similar project.
Very interesting. So we had an attendee ask, would you mind sharing what your kind of main goals are for your company in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes. So for us, we started in agronomy. It's so-called digital agriculture, where people started using yield maps from their harvesters, combines. And they started understanding that you can put all of this information on the map and analyze it on every acre, layer it and analyze it, analyze your costs, analyze your impact. So this is where the industry has been, and now we're really entering, and I'm very glad to be able to share that with you, that with the growing concern about climate change and consumer pressure, the agribusinesses are actually a lot more pragmatically looking at the sustainability space and investments into how soil can actually serve as a massive carbon sink. So turning agriculture from this kind of a villain of climate change action to actually one of the biggest solutions to climate change. the barriers have there been not just a resistance from the corporates or nothing like that. It's always a business question, whether there are incentives for it. And Europe has rolled out some incentives recently. I think America will follow suit. And all of the countries that sell into those markets, that import from those markets or export to those markets, will have to adjust to those policies as well. So in 5 to 10 years, I strongly hope that, and I strongly believe this will be possible in 10 years for sure, we will transition a significant portion of agriculture, maybe 25% of arable land, if we, apply our efforts smartly, into regenerative production. So really practicing not just what's good for the consumer who will be taking something from, not just what's good for the price of the product, but for the impact that that product makes on the environment and how that sets up that environment for future harvests. Because you might look it up, but FAO estimates that there's only 60 harvests left for us unless we're going to fix the regenerative agriculture problem, which means consumers will need to pay more for farmers to be able to farm differently, put cover crops in the ground, take care of their land differently. And I think this is possible, and it's the right time to act on it. And I would love for us in my lifetime to be starting the drawdown, to actually be starting to pull more carbon out of the atmosphere than we're pumping into it. And there's a lot that needs to happen for it. It's not a mission that Fluorescent alone or any company alone can achieve. But I think agriculture is a very big part of the solution, and we want to enable that change in agriculture.
That's wonderful. So I think maybe we have time for one more question, and I'll kind of group a couple together. So there's quite a few people asking more about your role as a female business leader. So as a woman in this field, how hard was it to get investors in your idea when you were starting Fluorescent? And did you encounter any barriers as a woman in this field in talking to male colleagues in this area about data and crop enhancement?
Yeah, I would say that I'm not a huge proponent of, yes, it's very gender biased. I think when we bring our agenda to the table, we need to bring the table stakes with us that say, if you're an investor talking to me, we're not doing this the gender biased way. And if you are the investor who's talking to me and you are gender biased, I am not talking to you. Believe me, there is more capital out there to invest than good businesses. It's not a huge problem to raise if you have a good business and there are lots of money flowing. It depends on the space, of course. Agriculture is a very hot space, hence my experience. There might be areas in the economy that are experiencing recession where what I said absolutely does not apply. But if you're starting a startup, if you're looking at growing a business, if you have a good business plan, for good businesses, there is money out there. And I'm pretty selective in terms of who we bring as investors. We are going to start the next round of investment, and I have effectively pre-selected the individuals and the funds who we think would be good for us. And of course, it's a matter of presenting the case to them, how it fits for them, for their plans. But I would say on one hand that I was lucky that I have the investors on my board who, of course, I have spent the time before taking their money with, and they are not gender biased, and then they enable me to really be propelling this, to be sharing this message. And I would like you to share it forward that the investment space in entrepreneurship, it's not black and white. If just because you see the statistics that this is how much capital women raise, I don't believe that there's absolutely no investors right now. There's so many women first, women focused funds. Many funds have equity targets. So there's a lot of investors out there who are actually looking to invest in women. And this dynamic will definitely improve over the next several years and decades.
Great. There's so many more questions and just lots of wonderful feedback from our attendees from all over the world who really appreciated this event and learning more about you, Anastasia, and about your work. and just lots of wonderful comments. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for questions. But if you enjoyed today's session and you want to support more women like Anastasia with aerospace engineering, space sciences, and as we've seen today, all the different areas that can take you, we hope you will consider a donation to the Amelia Earhart Fellowship Fund to support future engineers. On behalf of Zonta International President Sharon Langenbeck, Amelia Earhart Fellowship Chairman Holly Anderson, and Dr. Anastasia Volkova, thank you all again for joining us. We will have a recording of today's session on our website. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.